Welcome to Block and Order, the show that explores the legal issues facing the world of Web3. I'm Kyle Lawrence, and with me as always, my co-host and partner in crime, Moish Pelt. How are you, Moish?
Doing great, Kyle. Good to have you.
It's good to be had. Thank you so much. And with us
Anytime.
today, a very special guest, Carla Reyes. Carla is an associate professor of law at the SMU Dedman School. Professor Reyes is a nationally and internationally recognized leader on issues raised by the intersection of business law and technology. So you're a perfect guest for Block and Order. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much. How's the weather down there?
It's finally cool. We got a couple of nice cool weather days, which is kind of a relief at this point.
What does that mean for us Northeasterners?
Well, it's like 60 degrees, maybe.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty nice. So, Carla, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. We know that time is a precious commodity for all of us in this space. But when we talk to people who are passionate about Web3 and cryptocurrencies generally, I always like to find out, what was the aha moment for you? When did you realize that this is something you'd be passionate about and wanted to learn about in your professional studies?
This is a good question. So I actually sort of fell into the blockchain legal space. I was an electronic financial services lawyer at Perkins Coie in Seattle, doing more traditional payments work. When the partner that I worked really closely with, Dax Hansen, saw blockchain sort of on the rise and cryptocurrency on the rise as a payments mechanism, and really started digging into the work and sort of brought me along. And at first I was super skeptical and missed my opportunity to invest at a good price, frankly. It was like $10 Bitcoin back then, right? But over time, the more and more I learned about the technology, the more fascinated I became, and the more I trusted it and how it worked, the more I understood myself. And yeah, I think somewhere around the time I made the jump to academia is when I knew it's what I wanted to work on sort of forever. And I wanted to work in the questions that maybe clients weren't actively investigating, but would be good for them to know about. And that tends to be what I do.
So, Carla, in crypto, there's a lot of talk about, just in general, crypto is speed running the traditional financial system. And when you think about how crypto organizations have started to self-organize, do you think they're speed running the history of business organizations, in the sense of, we didn't have corporate law back in the 1880s and then now we do, but it took 120 years to get there? How's crypto speed running business organizations, in your impression?
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. I think to the extent that crypto organizations are speed running it, it's the thought that they don't need it at all, that this idea that they're illegal, and that if they just ignore business formation laws, then nothing applies. And that's not really how business entity law works. We have a default form that applies if you do nothing, assuming you fit the criteria. And I think it's really interesting that for crypto organizations, which focus so much on sort of being innovative in how they structure their transactions and how they structure their interactions on a large scale, and think about economies of scales in new ways, that they refuse to structure transactions and think creatively on the legal side, because in my view, they could go hand in hand. It's not opposite, right? You could privately structure these things in ways that could be effective for the innovative things they want to do with the technology also. But so I think to the extent that they're running the history of business organizations, it's this idea that they don't need it or that it doesn't apply when it definitely does. But otherwise, I think that they're doing oftentimes things when they're thinking about it, when there are organizations that are thinking about it, I think they're doing things that challenge the big corporate structures to do better. In particular around areas of governance. We've got this long history of corporate governance literature that suggests reforms for corporate boards, for example, that the corporations just haven't wanted to pick up for whatever reason, just trying to ignore it as best they can. And some of that stuff you see mirrored in proposals and structures in decentralized autonomous organizations. And to the extent that that succeeds, I think it's really going to challenge more traditional corporations to start thinking about those reforms more deliberately and implementing them. So I think it goes both ways.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it actually speaks to one of your articles that I read in depth because it's I felt seen for the first time as a business law practitioner, the uncorporate crypto governance from a
Yeah.
couple years ago. I mean that's something that I wish I had read 2 years ago when I first started, getting into this space. But you specifically say blockchain proponents often herald the technology as a tool for disrupting the corporate sphere and further democratizing society. However, more functional similarities exist between blockchains and corporations that are often acknowledged. I think you hit the nail on the head, and that's something that Moish and I encounter all the time when we have these clients who just like you said, we don't need a corporate governance structure. We're decentralized, and then they try to figure out how to pay themselves, and they can't figure out how to do it.
Yeah.
Since you wrote that 3 years ago, where do you think the paradigm shift has occurred, or where do you think is markedly different today than it was 3 years ago?
So I think the biggest difference is that people are being forced to pay attention to the issue because of the CFTC cases, in particular the case against UkiDAO, and because of the some of the decisions in like Van Loon v. OFAC. I think that some of the ways the court has come down is, I'm sorry to say, a little bit the way I predicted, which is that if you don't structure, bad things are going, like they're going to pick things that you wish you could have chosen differently,
Right.
because you ignored it. And yeah, so I think the big difference now is people have to pay attention because some of my predictions have become true, unfortunately. Whereas back then it was sort of this like, oh, she's thinking as an academic, blah blah, right? It doesn't really apply, but I think the lesson certainly does. Like you could structure to avoid this stuff. You just have to be creative in the way you structure and build your contracts, both on and off chain.
But do we have a good example in, say, the annals of corporate law about how philosophically corporate law should work in a more decentralized governance type structure? Like you mentioned earlier that, there are governance proposals being proposed to these very large companies, and just for institutional or, political reasons, they're not being adopted. Here we have, in some cases, right, carte blanche. Let's try it again, or let's propose this thing and it'll get adopted if it's philosophically aligned. But do we have kind of a decentralized governance body of law that we can look to and say, maybe it's in nonprofits, or maybe it's something where there's more of a broad base of participants versus a top down corporate structure? Like what does the law say about that?
Yeah, so I think the places that people look to the most, and it's interesting. So a colleague here at SMU Law and I, Christine Hurt, we're working on a new paper called Creating a Digital, what are we calling it? Creating a digital non-entity, which is this idea of like, how could you structure something on a more decentralized basis via contracts without, intentionally sort of structuring it contractually. Versus filing with the state for a top-down structure. But the things that we've seen crypto entities use quite well that mirrors that flat organizational structure that they would prefer, that flatter governance structure that they would prefer, includes things like the LLC, right? A member-managed LLC, the decentralized unincorporated nonprofit association, which some states have adopted a new version of their statute, right, to reflect the usefulness of that. Although that largely, because of the liability questions, applies to things like protocol DAOs, right? Not necessarily
Right.
all DAOs, not appropriate for everything. I think we've seen some success with series LLCs. I think people have, in practice, incorporated at least a couple, anyway, that I know of. Blockchain-based LLCs in Vermont. And then you've got Dash, which is a business trust. It's not a business trust based in the United States, but it's a business trust, and it works quite well for their structure. So I do think there are some examples in the wild of entities that have been used, and they are in the entity sections. Why I called it uncorporate crypto governance, because anything that's unincorporated, an LLC, a trust, etc., falls on the unside, and that tends to be where you can find the flatter governance structure. There is this really interesting argument from Professor Lepaki, who's now at University of Florida, suggesting that in Delaware, at least, you could create a corporation and in the charter say that it will be governed by the shareholders, and that you don't have to have a board of directors. And so then you could have a corporate structure that is also equally flat in terms of its governance. And he said he filed one, like in this paper, he says, I did it and nobody rejected it. But I don't know like what happens in real life if you actually do that or if anyone has.
That's interesting. I mean, Delaware, they'll often rubber stamp most things that get set before them. What's interesting is you mentioned a couple of different types of entities that people can use for these things. That you mentioned the Vermont blockchain-based business. Moish and I have seen a couple in different states, and each day it seems states are trying to approach this differently. With the federal government largely at a standstill, and the idea of what's going to work, for all these types of businesses, is there one in particular that you think stands out that could be adopted nationally? You mentioned the unincorporated nonprofit association, which we've implemented a couple of times. I just think it's interesting when I explain to people what it is. It's an unincorporated entity that you actually have to file something at the state for the state to acknowledge it, and the 12 states that do. It's classic lawyers, make everything as difficult as possible. It makes no sense.
Yeah. So I guess I have two answers. In the past, I have suggested that a business trust model could work. There are states still, I think it's about half and half. There are half the states still that would recognize the creation of a business trust as a separate entity entirely via contract at common law. It's the same kind of business trust, the Massachusetts business trust that Rockefeller used, hence the title of the paper, If Rockefeller Were a Coder. But because it was the trust that Rockefeller used and a la antitrust, right? Many states have created a statutory trust regime, which also then, right, you have to file and you can't entirely be at common law or entirely via contract. However, what Professor Hurt and I are trying to explore in this new research is the idea of a entirely contract-based joint venture arrangement, which there's a series of new case law out of Delaware that suggests that perhaps not all joint ventures will be regulated by general partnership law, the way typically courts just apply general partnership law to joint ventures and call it good,
right. Yeah.
Which would be excellent because of like joint and several liability questions, right? And maybe not all of the things about general partnership law fit well, as I've argued in the past, to decentralized autonomous organizations. But we're still not really sure how it all works yet. I do think the extra layer from that exists now that didn't exist when, say, I was writing If Rockefeller Were a Coder, or maybe even the Uncorporate Crypto Governance paper, is the Corporate Transparency Act. And that changes the considerations a bit, not entirely, but a bit. So yeah, I think continually the thing people continue to see work are the LLCs, particularly when it is a for-profit venture. They're quite valuable, right? You can contract like lots of stuff into your LLC structure. You can be as creative as you want. You just have to file, and that's sometimes where the rubber meets the road, right? But we do see states adopting, amendments to their LLC statutes to try and accommodate decentralized autonomous organizations. I'm not entirely sure that's always warranted. And sometimes I think maybe it creates confusion about whether you have to use that specific entity type versus another. But I also think it'll be interesting to watch the Utah law, where they adopted the koala model law, which is a little bit of an idea of like, if you structure the technology this way, then you qualify for certain benefits as though you had filed almost, right? And it'll be interesting to see if people make use of that or how it works. We'll see.
So a lot of the conversation, I mean, certainly among U.S. attorneys, but then also academia, I think kind of defaults to a U.S.-centric Delaware corporate law kind of view of the world. What, if anything, should we, should we just say that that's Delaware corporate law is Delaware corporate law because it's the best, and it's the best because it's Delaware corporate law. And so therefore everything we're building in Web3 should philosophically follow in that footsteps? Or can we say, hey, maybe this is an area where we should actually look outside the US and we should adopt, a lot of blockchain ventures, I think, that are very successful have formed offshore. Now, in that private contracting context, maybe they're recontracting a lot of things that are very, very similar to Delaware law, but what can we learn from them? And maybe is it worth me being a US centric folk kind of saying, hey, let's think philosophically more along the lines of this other jurisdiction.
It's an excellent point, right? So I always default to US because that's all I know. But
Right.
although I have been contracted to write a book chapter that surveys it more broadly, so maybe I'll learn more about other countries' organizational laws. But I do know that at least I think it's Liechtenstein, Malta. There are a couple of other places that have really quite advanced thinking about this particular issue. And it's not uncommon at all for successful organizations to go there. And certainly my favorite business trust example, Dash, they're a New Zealand business trust. They're not a business trust in the United States, right? So it's just another example where it's just more clear there and it's easier. So that's what they did. I'd like to think it was because of my paper, but it's fine. But no, certainly, I think absolutely there's value in looking abroad and to thinking about, what even importing some of those models to the US, if we could at the state level, kind of like the Utah law adopting the Koala Model Law, which the Koala Model Law was a collaboration of legal scholars and practitioners from all over the world. So that certainly has a more comparative aspect to it. But certainly it's never my first default because I'm not licensed in those jurisdictions. But certainly it's something to think about.
That's a good answer. Broadly speaking, in terms of DAOs specifically, a year ago, Moish and I had probably 10 to 12 calls a week of people wanting to start DAOs. They had a crypto project, they had an NFT launch, whatever it was, and they wanted to start these DAOs. That was going to be the wave of the future. Now here we sit at the end of 2023. Do you think this model has failed overall? Do you think there's still a future for these types of organizations? What are your thoughts on where we were a year ago and where we are now and maybe where we're going to be a year from now?
So I definitely think there's still a future for these types of organizations. I think that's the way I put it in a prior conference. I'll say again, I think that these types of organizations are they're creatures of private law, and private law is quite flexible. And there's, in my view, nothing that a little creativity and excellent lawyering can't overcome to help clients get to the type of organization and the type of governance of that organization that they want to pursue. It is going to take, I think, more than the organizations themselves. I think it takes lawyers who are both technically savvy and contractually creative enough to put in the work to help the clients reach both their technical and contractual goals. Because I really do think that the two align more closely than maybe sometimes people think about. I think what we might see in the future, for me, it's not as much of a question like, will DAOs continue to exist? It's more like, what does the lawyer for a DAO actually look like going forward? And I think increasingly my prediction would be that they're a little bit more of a product lawyer / entity structurer, right? Where they're a little bit more involved in advising how the technology should work in order to reflect the organizational structure that folks want and that should be reflected in the contract.
So they look like us.
Yeah, exactly.
Carla, I know you're very active in the UCC and efforts there to, I guess, why should blockchain people take notice of what the UCC is doing and what are you working on there?
Yeah, so I was an advisor to the both the study committee and the drafting committee for the what it ultimately ended up being the 2022 UCC amendments. And basically, like in a nutshell, what the 2022 UCC amendments do, in addition to like a whole bunch of stuff that has nothing to do with cryptocurrency, but everything to do with emerging technologies and their implications for things like sales law and banking transfers in like Article 4A, et cetera. In addition to that stuff, what it does for crypto is basically give cryptocurrency the private law rules that we all think it already has, right? So everyone's running around transacting in crypto as though it's freely transferable. It's negotiable, essentially that they're bearer assets, right? But the private law to support that understanding of what they are isn't fully there. There are ways you could structure very carefully to make it true, but it adds transaction costs. It's inefficient, and it actually forces re-centralization in some circumstances. And what the 2022 amendments do is give you the effect of all that fancy structuring with more simple rules that allow people to continue to interact and I guess transact with cryptocurrency in a decentralized way, the way you're supposed to be able to do, with all the expectations that when you receive, say, Bitcoin, you're getting it free and clear of any prior claims, and you can like trust that it's yours. The same way when you get a $5 bill, you're getting that $5 bill and it's yours, and you're getting it free and clear of any prior claims. Yeah, that's what's happening there, and that's why the crypto world should pay attention, because the rules they think that apply, unless it's in a state, at least in the U.S., at least in if it's in a state that has not adopted the 2022 amendments, those rules don't actually apply unless you're doing fancy structures. And it's true actually internationally as well. I'm also involved as an expert advisor to the UniDraw project on private law and digital assets, which is actually like looking at that exact same issue, but on a global sort of harmonization of law scale.
So in the same way, the UCC is now adopting amendments to contemplate crypto. Do you think that other more traditional, corporate governance laws, like just in the way companies are ordinarily governed, like on the NASDAQ and stock exchange, et cetera, are they going to start implementing, potentially blockchain technology for transparency in voting, or shareholder governance, or maybe not at the public company level at first, but like, do you see any discussions about that, or are we still too early for anything like that?
No, I've seen discussions about that, both at the level of sort of legal harmonization groups, wondering like, is it time to think about the model laws that exist and, how it should react to these developments in the States, for example, but also in terms of folks working on structures like NASDAQ and the capital markets exchanges, like how could we make this work better? How could the plumbing work better? I mean, there's that famous case out of Delaware with the footnote that's like, the plumbing sucks and blockchain would be better, right? And people are still thinking about that. It hasn't moved very quickly, but people are still thinking about it and wondering how they could implement it. So yeah, I think definitely people are thinking about it, and I think you see it in the smaller ventures. I think you see people working to adopt it. I know there are companies who will help you issue your equity via tokens, and then smart contract, use smart contracts to help you implement your contractual requirements or your regulatory requirements around that issuance into the tokens, so that you like literally can't disobey. But I've also am involved here at SMU in projects or research around how decentralized entities and decentralized governance structure can help like mom and pop shops and rural agricultural firms who are just trying to sell their stuff beyond their local farmer markets. Like how could that help them scale up their businesses? And yeah, I think there's a lot of interest in all of that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, one of the things that Kyle always says is, you can be a security. It's not the end of the world. There are like securities, and you can choose to be that. And I think one of the things we're going to see over the next, I'm guessing 2-year cycle is security tokens being increasingly offered, and then platforms on the back end allowing additional functionality. And like what you're saying, right, is people able to then use their security tokens to then do complex governance, things with their crypto. So
yeah, and there are platforms that'll like manage your cap tables for you and like do all these these.
They're our best friend, those platforms. We use them a lot.
We work with some of them, and they're doing very interesting things. And I think as you see these assets becoming more and more kind of interoperable, and representing not just security interests, but then also your governance rights and your ability to log on to a platform and take shareholder actions, it becomes very interesting.
And that all dovetails really nicely with my colleague here, Christina Sauter. She does a lot of work on like wireless investors and the new generation of investors who would be more prone to use a platform like that than really anything else. So anyway, it's a good time to be at SMU. I've got all these colleagues working on really interesting things that intersect really nicely with stuff I'm doing. So it's fun.
Well, that's fascinating.
That's really excellent, Carla. And I want to thank you again for your time. I know we're running a little short on time, and I want to be sensitive of your schedule. But before we let you go, what's next on the speaking circuit for you? What's coming next for you in your publications and whatnot?
That's a good question. So I guess this week I'll be on a panel regarding DAOs at the North American Blockchain Summit right here in Fort Worth. And then I don't think I have much until the spring term. I try to take a break around the holidays and hang out with my kids. They're going to cross country nationals in early December.
Oh, wow.
So that's my next trip after
Awesome.
this week. Yeah.
That's exciting.
Well, Carla, thank you so much for joining us here. Really appreciate it. And thanks for all the great work you do. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really fun.
Well, that was fantastic. I'm so thrilled that we got to spend some time with Carla. She was really wonderful and eloquent, and I really loved what she had to say about the space. It just makes me excited as a practitioner to have somebody else who knows what they're talking about.
Yeah, she was absolutely fantastic. And I think there's a lot for crypto organizations to learn from the last 120 years of corporate law, that, we don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Right.
But there are some reasons that we should reinvent the wheel. And so it's balancing, innovation with it's already been done before. You don't need to start over again.
Listen, that's what I say. When you have a good starting point, you don't need to, we don't get paid by the word, although we do get paid by the hour. So I don't know. I don't know how you square that round hole. So anyway, well, Moish, crypto spring is here. Congratulations. Your NFTs are not going to be worthless anymore.
Let's go to the top of the order here.
Let's do it, man. Well, what can I say? NFTs are finally not scraping the bottom of the barrel. They actually may be climbing up in price, and it's evidenced by the trends we're seeing. Bored Ape Yacht Club is up 140% in the last 30 days in terms of trading volume. CryptoPunks is up. Gods Unchained is up. Bitcoin is doing really well. It's up 34% for the year. Solana is booming. Moish, this is just phenomenal news. What do you attribute it to?
Oh, no, I disagree. NFTs are dead. That's it. They're dead. It's just done. No. Look, I think, Bitcoin and Ethereum are very, very long-term plays, and there's going to be huge volatility. I think it's interesting that you're seeing such a huge uptick in the NFT sales. Some of which I think is just due to the macro of everything else kind of starting to go up again. But I think some of it is, projects that have been around for a while and people are still interested in, for one reason or another, aren't going away. They have some staying power. And I think it's true that can be true. And also 95% of NFTs can be worthless, but the long, nobody cares about the long tail anyways.
Right.
Right. So you're seeing an uptick, and I think that's cool.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. Do you think that what we're seeing in the market is surprising given what's come out from the regulators? The SEC has been very aggressive. You're seeing all these actions in founders, high profile cases of people being locked up for fraud and causing people just to lose a ton of money. Do you find it surprising just given all of the negativity that surrounds the space, or that's just part and parcel of it?
Yeah, I think on the one hand, it is surprising just that from a regulatory perspective, I'm not sure blockchain has been in a worse position than it is now.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's almost like despite that, everything's look, the bad actors that are fraudsters that are going away for crimes they did, great. The government should be doing that. Right. I think some of the court cases that are playing out are showing that the regulatory claims that are being made are more complicated than just what the regulator says. There's good arguments, there's good actors, there's bad arguments, and there's bad actors, and that's kind of all playing out in the courts. So I think that's happening. And I think amidst that, you're seeing projects that have staying power, assets that people believe in for one reason or another, continue to have value. And I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. One of the things that I always say when I want to be a little snarky to people who want to poo-poo crypto, and it's SBF went to jail. That's the end of crypto, right? And it's I remember when Lehman Brothers collapsed and the stock market ceased to exist, and Bear Stearns, and it's just a ridiculous thing that people say. I think they want it to be dead because it's Schadenfreude on their part, and they laugh at it, and I think that's not fair. But this is just fantastic news, and finally the things behind me can have some real value. Although I do love them, so it's That's always really cool.
Yeah, I'm wearing my Cool Cat sweater, and I stopped getting notifications about my Cool Cat for a very long time.
I still get a lot of notifications about mine. They're not for much, but maybe now they'll start to go up a bit. Okay, so next up on the order is about crypto gaming. So, Moish, blockchain gaming has encountered substantial challenges of late, leading numerous games to be indefinitely halted by their developers and others opting to switch chains altogether. In 2022, 157 blockchain games were halted or they ceased their development, while another 43 titles were halted this year, according to a new report released by Game7 on the state of the Web3 gaming industry. 65 blockchain games have moved networks so far this year, up from 48 games doing the same thing last year. And while some of these developers have switched chains to maximize lower costs, others have moved due to broader market and regulatory concerns. So Moish, as somebody who's very familiar with the gaming industry, what do you attribute this type of movement to, generally speaking?
Yeah, it's hard to put it on any one cause. I think it's interesting just from a meta perspective that a lot of these games take a really long time to develop. They have, a very long development cycle, 2, 3, 4 years, perhaps. There's a lot of investment that goes into it. And, things change. You start on one chain, you start with some sort of funding. Maybe you have an ecosystem partner that wants you to develop on a certain chain. And 2 years later, you're looking at a completely different environment where it may not be economical. You may have lost partner funding, or there's just new technology that you think is going to be a more attractive bet for either your development environment, or for, where gamers want to game. Mm-hmm. So I think this shows just how difficult it is to develop a high level game in any environment. I think it shows that there's, aside from the gaming industry as a whole, how difficult it is to develop for Web3 games. And I think you're also seeing just, we live in a multi-chain environment. Some chains are better for some things.
Right.
And that calculus, I think, changes over time as well.
Sure. Which of the chains do you think would be the most ideal landing spot, or are they going to develop, some of these people are going to develop their own chains to support their games?
Yeah. I think in an ideal world, right, I think a lot of the culture is on Ethereum, right? That's what you hear.
Of course.
I think that's what people want to do. But for small microtransactions involved in games, it's just not economical for the majority of gamers to, pay like a few dollars per transaction for fees, right? So you're seeing migration to, like Polygon is an example that's it's like Ethereum in many respects. The development environment's very similar, but the network speed and transaction fees are much lower. You're seeing a lot of layer 2s, and that way there's more interoperability with the base chain. And then you're seeing just lots of other experimentation. Like people are saying, hey, there's a new chain. And it's also economics, right? If there's a development fund for that chain and they're saying, hey, come make a game over here, and someone's dangling money in front of you, it's certainly attractive. But you got to think long term, what's best for the gaming studio and the gamers.
Right. I mean, I would think layer 2s would be a natural solution for them, just due to the speed that they on which they operate would be helpful, for especially some of these games that are huge.
Yeah, but then it makes it difficult for customers if you don't have finality. If it takes a week for you to roll up your assets to mainnet, then what if you got to defeat a boss in the intervening day or something? It could not be ideal. So that's why you're seeing all these trade-offs, and that's obviously manifesting in the way people develop games.
Sure. Now, you were right. We could probably spend 45 minutes on that topic, but sadly, the order stops for no man. Next up on the agenda, we have SafeMoon. Moish, about a week ago, the SEC charged 3 of the members of SafeMoon's executive team with perpetrating a massive fraud on its participants, in a case that was also targeted by the federal courts as well. They charged with conspiracy to commit securities fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and money laundering. The gist here is that these guys had this platform where they were supposed to be pooling money, and they told everybody that it was safe, and and it was going to safely to the moon, SafeMoon, not just a clever name. And I remember when this was happening, people used to approach us all the time. We want to do what those guys are doing, but they're not getting arrested. What they're doing is totally legit. Well, at the end of the day, we found out that the three executives had took approximately $200 million from the company's reserves and spent it on, assets in furtherance of the company's best interests, such as cars, first-class air travel, condos in Miami, all the things that a growing nascent business needs. Moish, I think this, it's obvious, but do you think some helpful regulations might have helped prevent this kind of situation from happening?
Well, that's why it's so frustrating. I mean, first of all, when you hear one Lambo, and people are buying Lambos, it's like, well, where did that money come from?
Yeah.
Hopefully not user funds, but we're seeing over and over again, at least the allegations that that's where the money is sourced from. But yeah, I mean, look, the more that a regulator can come in and say, hey, we see something happening in the market that is suspect. Why wait 2 years and a full market cycle to say that?
That's a great point.
And look, these are all allegations, right? And I think the defendants here are entitled to presumption of innocence and are entitled to a full defense. So I don't want to come in and presume what happened here. But it's like, if the regulators are not going to come out and see something, when you see something, say something kind of attitude, then what are we doing here? Right? Why are we waiting 2 years to go after people that we think are misappropriating investor funds and committing all sorts of malfeasance if those allegations are true? So yeah, I mean, Kyle, in other industries, does the regulator just sit back for a few years and I guess I know the answer to that one too. Sometimes they obviously do, right? But
right. Well, it depends on who it is. I mean, we've seen it before. Department of Labor, when they do a workplace audit on you, that happens very quickly for a variety of reasons. You need to nip the wrongdoing in the bud. You need to protect the people who are being exploited. But I'm with you 100%. I mean, it's not like the SEC is eating cat food. They're a well-funded government regulator, and they have the resources to go after these people. And when you have people that they have been going after who just made a couple of, ill-advised tweets, and now you have these guys, with all due respect to their presumption of innocence, are really flaunting it in everyone's faces, I think there's a problem there. And one thing I'd like to just close on this topic with, we do say at the end of every episode that nothing contained herein is meant to be legal advice. Well, here's free legal advice. If someone else is doing it and they haven't gotten arrested, that is not a defense for you. Anybody listening, if you're speeding down the highway, you can get a ticket. I don't care if somebody else is not getting stopped for it. So there, that's my
but I think that's an excellent point about if everyone's speeding and then everyone says, hey, everyone's getting away with it, let's speed too. And then the police department knows that, and they're not enforcing it, and they're choosing not to enforce it for years. And then everyone else starts speeding because there's no consequences. Then you failed as a regulator, haven't you?
I mean, you just named the biggest criticism that people have at the Department of Buildings here in Merrick, when you can have electrical lines that are not grounded properly, and every once in a while they come around and give you a ticket. I can't say from personal experience, but that happens, and it's very frustrating. I mean, you see that through all industries, from all kinds of different policing bodies and governmental agencies. It's the problem du jour. What can we capitalize upon? I don't mean to be so cynical about it, but that's what it feels like. So,
all right.
Now I'm all upset.
Well, now we're all angry. Well, moving on to our next topic. Yuga Labs announced a partnership this past week with Magic Eden. This is from their Ape Fest in Hong Kong. And the collaboration's geared towards the introduction of a new marketplace that promises to maintain creator royalties on all purchases of NFTs. And the Yuga Labs CEO, Daniel Allegre, said the firm will continue to support artists and promised a late 2023 deployment of this new marketplace. So, Kyle, what do you think about this next step in protecting the abilities for independent artists to collect their royalties for their work?
Sure. Well, to back up a second, I think this is a no-brainer. I think back in August, when OpenSea said that they were not going to, have mandatory royalties. Yuga Labs was just really upset about that news. They came out publicly and bashed them. So this is certainly no surprise. And I do think that, competition in the marketplace is a good thing. You never want to have a monopoly. I mean, 2 years ago, OpenSea was 98% or something of the trading volume, and now they're whittled down to a fraction of that. So this definitely will help competitive forces. It'll help artists get their art out there, and it will help them get paid for the art that they do put out there. To me, this is unsurprising, and I applaud Yuga Labs for taking the step and doing this, and also doing it with Magic Eden. I love Magic Eden. Magic Eden is awesome for people out there who haven't used it. It's really user friendly, and there's just great stuff on it. I implore you to go check it out. But I'm curious as to what is going to happen to the other markets that have tried to open up to compete with OpenSea. Where do you think the competition is going to lead now that Yuga is doing this?
Well, I mean, look, I agree with you on one respect. Like, I applaud Yuga Labs for trying. I agree that, Magic Eden, like, great. Let's give them a shot. I think part of this, though, is like, look, I want artists to get paid. I think one of the coolest use cases of NFTs is getting artists paid and getting them paid for resales that happen downstream in perpetuity. That, like, point one headline is, like, let's pay artists for their work and let's allow creators to find ways to be compensated. However, right, this is just pure economics. If there's one marketplace where the cost to trade is X and there's one marketplace where the cost to trade is X plus 10%, the reality is a lot of people are going to choose the cheaper marketplace, even if that circumvents artists putting food to their tables. So, I applaud it, but I guess I'm cautiously optimistic that, if you take the largest NFT like seller and company and you have them commit to one marketplace and you give their ecosystem incentives to trade in that marketplace, that this could work. I'm also, like, concerned that, like, the economics are the economics, and there's just always going to be a race to the bottom for people to trade on other marketplaces that are just lower cost.
I don't disagree with that completely, but I would posit a question to you that I think I asked you once before. When Radiohead puts out a new album and they say, pay us whatever you want for it, you'll give them a fair market price for the album. You won't just do a penny, which a lot of people do. But I think we as all this talk about tipping culture and what do we owe people who help us. I think there is a paradigm shift in how we view supporting artists and supporting people who aren't necessarily as well compensated as we would want them to be. It's not 100%. Obviously, I'm not going to delude myself into thinking that everybody's going to be on board with that. But I do think there is something to be said for people wanting to support these people who have historically been marginalized economically.
Yeah, and I agree completely with that. And I think it does take buy-in from the artist, from the NFT company to not just, like, select a platform, but then to create like real reasons for a community to trade on one platform versus another. Benefits for the ecosystem as a whole, benefits to the artist, but benefits for the user. And I don't think we've really seen that partnership be a real partnership. And so perhaps this is an opportunity to see that.
Yeah, fair point. Well, next up, we have the good old IRS. Everybody's best friend is back in the news. Officials from the Internal Revenue Service and the United States Treasury had submitted a mechanism for people to give comments on how the industry might self-identify assets that have nothing to do with finance traditionally, and whether stable coins should be left out of this proposal. And I was actually kind of shocked to see that the comment period ended today, and they received over 124,000 comments in on the IRS proposal, namely with respect to what is a broker and whether or not stable coins should be removed from this proposal one night. I thought that was a crazy high number. Good for people who were motivated, Nate, the IRS. Do you think that's a lot?
Maybe it was, thanks to all our listeners who submitted comments.
That's
and
it.
We helped bump that number up, a little bit.
Yeah.
Look, I think it's actually still counting, right? Comments are due by the end of the day today. So we'll see what that final number is. But certainly this riled some people up and got a lot of comments. And I know that the IRS had a listening session today. It sounded like the reports were, it was productive. And there's the IRS left the door open for continued changes to the reporting requirements, which I think would be welcome.
Mm-hmm.
As it was proposed, which I think is insane to me, the IRS is like, yeah, of course, this is fine, and it's going to generate 8 billion 1099s in like I forget what the time period is, but it's like some ridiculous number over some not that long amount of time. And it's like, well, who does that benefit? If the IRS all of a sudden gets 8 billion new 1099s for crypto reporting, like, come on, like, what are we doing here?
Right. Yeah, I guess that they probably don't have the resources to administer those kinds of things. And then you also have the added issue with this, which you have a lot of agents who are not necessarily familiar with how to view these assets or how to read them on the ledger. Obviously they're not dumb. They know what they're doing and they're tax professionals, but it's a new thing. And anytime you have a new thing in government, it doesn't just happen overnight. I mean, we've seen that time and time again where there's a process to roll in those. 8 billion, that's a lot. I did see a lot of comments about government overreach with the IRS doing this, which I guess is just, that's where we are as a society. But what types of standards do you think that the IRS could introduce here to address these people's concerns, or to address the sort of global comments that we've seen come in so far?
I think one of the things that I saw that I thought made sense is like, look, why should we bite off all of this in one like bite, right? Why not start with centralized exchanges, give that a year or two to make its way through the system, and then like reevaluate?
Right.
Like, why are we trying to say, okay, everything's a broker now?
Yeah.
Everyone's a reporting entity. MetaMask, Uniswap, like you name it. You're now a broker. You're issuing 10. It just seems like that's calculated to just cause destruction and chaos. Let's start with centralized exchanges, which I think everyone agrees is like a good natural place to do reporting. Let's get everyone standardized and bought in on that front. And then let's like reevaluate in a year or two. I mean, this is like for 2024, I guess here we are in November 23. So it's not that far away. It just seems insane that there would be this kind of process that would be undertaken the next year.
Yeah. And that's a great point. And it's something that I've often said about, crypto regulations, generally speaking. The worst thing that we can have is a Sarbanes-Oxley type, just broad brush. It sweeps everything up into one regulation. It's not going to make sense. Regulate stablecoin, regulate something, one thing, see how it works, and then pivot. Don't do this broad swath thing, which they're going to muck it up.
Yeah.
So, and with that, Moish, we thank you to all our listeners and all our viewers out there. Another great episode of Block and Order. Remember that nothing you've heard in this show constitutes legal advice. Please consult your own attorney if you're going to dive down the rabbit hole. An extra special thanks to Carla Reyes, who took time out of her important schedule to join us today for an interview. And another special thanks to producer Zabby and producer Chris. I'm Kyle Lawrence. Moish.
I'm Moish Peltz. Thank you, everyone.